All right, waiting for one more person to connect. Where are you based, Christina?
In Utrecht.
Utrecht, all right. Close by. Oh, that's nice, actually. All right, I see Alice is trying to connect, but we're gonna slowly get started. Good, so today we have a short hour. It's a bit of a sneak preview, I think, of some bigger courses that we do offer at RSM. And we're talking about a big subject, right? So we're talking about culture. And there's a couple more words on here that are relevant, using the word resilience here. And you see the notion of craft, which is relevant for my approach to this subject. So resilience for me, what we're trying to talk about is that we're living in difficult, challenging times, right? So we are not just living in an era of change, to quote Jan Rotmans, but in a change of era. And what that requires from organizations is to build resiliency, right? And that is a balance between stability and adaptation, which is very difficult to strike. And for me, one of the main areas where we can manage that is by having a healthy culture, right? A strong culture that allows us to do that, to be flexible enough to adjust and adapt, but still also strong enough to stick to our principles and not succumb to short-term pressures. I also have the notion of craft here, as for me, dealing with culture is not a science. It's also not an art. It's just a lot of hard work, and that requires a real human touch, right? It's something that is never finished, is never perfect. There's always room for improvement, and it requires us to develop a deep understanding, but also sensibility, I guess, for cultural dynamics in your organization. And then on top of that, productive ways in which you can shape culture and craft culture and affect change, right? That is often not a massive design exercise, right? But it has to do with a lot of little actions that add up to a bigger picture, right? So that's the notion of craft there. For those of you that just joined, very welcome to this short webinar. Please introduce yourself briefly in the chat. It'd be lovely to see where you're joining us from, what role you're in. You didn't miss much. I just introduced the title, talked very briefly about why resiliency and why craft. This webinar is part or is a sneak preview for a bigger course that we have. There's some information there as well that you could look at after the session. All right, so a little bit about, maybe before I get here, a little bit about my background. So I've worked briefly at RSM before. I did my PhD here, and then I worked at Cambridge. And one of the things that I worked on there was large programs, executive programs for big banks. So it was a time where banks had faced a number of scandals. The financial crash had happened, but also a number of continuous problems with fraudulent behavior. And we were involved in a big program to try and help the bank build a better compliance function that was not just dealing with legal issues, but also very much dealing with cultural issues. So during this time, I learned about one example of what can happen if a culture is left unchecked, basically, right? So organizations that do not pay active attention to culture, do not craft it actively, can face the dramatic failures, right? So there's a great book here by Joris Luijendijk that I'm highlighting that has described how over time, organizations that had actually really strong cultures, that were protecting long-term outcomes, long-term value, quite quickly deteriorated and really became a blueprint for short-termism, right? And this was very much a cultural problem. A very insightful report on this issue was a report written for Barclays Bank that I've worked with, where at this time they attracted an independent reviewer, Saltz, his name was Anthony Saltz, and he wrote about this issue. He did an investigation and he wrote about what had happened in his organization, what had gone so wrong that led to these number of scandals, right? So he wrote, despite some attempts to establish group-wide values, the culture that emerged tended to favor transactions over relationships, the short term over sustainability, and financial over other business purposes. The overriding purpose at Barclays in the lead up to the crisis and beyond was expressed in terms of increases in revenues and profits, return on equity, and competitive position. Generally, banks took too much comfort from some business practices being standard in the industry. Regulation alone cannot address the fundamental underlying causes that led to the business practices which are in the spotlight. And across this whole bank, there were no clearly articulated and understood values. So there could hardly be much consensus among employees as to what the values were and what should guide everyday behaviors. And as a result, there was no consistency to the development of a desired culture. And now this is important. However, culture exists regardless, right? If left to its own devices, it shapes itself with the inherent risk that behaviors will not be those desired. Employees will work out for themselves what is valued by leaders to whom they report. And the developing cultures across this bank were still less consistent as a result of a highly decentralized business model that tended to give rise to silos, leaving a cultural ambiguity at the heart of the bank. All right. That's a mouthful, and that is a pretty extreme context that I think anybody would want to avoid. So a couple of high-level lessons that we should take from this. One is this famous quote, right, that culture trumps everything, right? I'm sure some of you have seen this before. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, operational excellence for lunch, and everything else for dinner. Right? Meaning, if we do not pay proper attention to culture, we can have great plans, great ambitions, but we're not going to be able to realize them. Right? Another quote that I find even actually more powerful, and I'd like you to reflect on that, is this idea that culture is often depicted as something that's difficult to manage when it gets out of control. Right? It's something that constrains people. It's often seen also by leadership as something that actually is mostly a byproduct or mostly negative. But as leaders, actually, we need to think very carefully about our own role. And a quote that I love is from Edgar Schein, who wrote, "One could argue that the only real thing of importance that leaders do is to create and manage culture." And I'd like you to think a little bit about that. So for those of you that, in some ways are a leader, would you agree with this? That actually the only thing that you do as a leader is to create and manage culture, if we're thinking about things that are truly important. Would you agree with that? Any thoughts? And write in the chat as well. Do you have a thought on this, Christina?
I definitely
go ahead.
I definitely think that you, as a leader, can make or break your culture. That's for sure.
Okay. That's slightly more nuanced opinion, right? So tone from the top. I also see Robert Jan writing. The only real thing might be too much, Nick says, but yes, definitely. David says, although the question is how conscious one can do this, right? I think that's a very good point. My interpretation of this quote is that in the first place, right, the more senior you are as a leader, the higher up in the organization, the more you are a symbol of the organizational culture, right? And that is very important to remember, right? So everything you do has an impact on the culture, right? So when you make a strategy, how you chair a meeting, how you run a town hall, right? In the first place, you need to think about what am I signaling to the organization culturally, right? Before you're thinking about the more instrumental value of these actions, right? So that is my interpretation. And I think for me, I have some degree of leadership responsibility. I try to reflect on this, right? So how is my behavior reflective or symbolizing the values that we stand for, right? And what can I potentially do to improve that, right? And this quote says that is often even more impactful, right, than your actual technical instrumental plans, right? Because here you can make a real difference. You can make a real positive difference, right? Or you can make a real negative difference if actually what you symbolize doesn't really land in the organization, or is not seem to reflect the values that the organization likes to stand for, right? And then you have a difficult time as a leader, right? You will find friction. You will struggle actually to get things done, right? Because you're not seen to symbolize the direction that the organization hopes to get to. Yeah. Is it only formal leaders? How about informal leaders? If they run against it, do the formal leaders fail? Yeah, I think that's a really nice example, right? Leadership is already an ambiguous term. So for sure, the people in power have a really important role here. But in principle, we can all take some responsibility of the culture. We all have some agency in the organization, right? So we should all think about how we can act as symbols, as elements that can perpetuate and hold a culture, right? Jan Joos writes, in essence, culture is how we show up each day, leaders and actually all. It's also what behavior we accept every day. Very nice. I think that's a very good way of summarizing it, right? So this is the first thing that I want to reflect on. I think in many organizations, when we're put under pressure, we forget about this, right? We quickly forget about the importance of signaling what we stand for and acting in the spirit of the culture. And what we do when we succumb to pressure, when we focus on shorter-term pressure, shorter-term targets, right? We're sending often the wrong signals, right? And we can actually break strong cultures. A culture should fit the mission and vision of the organization, as they tend to change every so many years. So should the culture be changed as well, or should that remain more stable? I think that's a very nice question, Robert Jan, and I think it's something that we will try and explore a little bit during this session. Okay, so I have a model towards the end that can relate to this a little bit. All right, what I'd like to do next is learn a little bit more from specific cultural failures. So how can culture go wrong? And then look at the slightly more positive case about how I have come to approach culture. And what I think is a slightly more successful organization in how culture was managed. A first stereotypical failure is the problem that I've come to call the banana problem, which is a dynamic of cultural inertia, right? So here we assume a situation that we've created an organization, a culture has emerged, but it's left unmanaged, unchecked. And at some point, behavior sticks in the organization that becomes taken for granted. And as a result, we struggle to realize certain benefits, okay? And it's powerfully symbolized by this story. This is a story that talks about an experiment that was done in the 1950s. And in this experiment, scientists had a cage. And in the cage, they had a ladder. On top of the ladder, they had some bananas. And in the cage, they placed a monkey. Unbeknownst to the monkey, there was a water cannon also in the cage. And every time the monkey would go up to the top of the stairs, the water cannon would shoot off and would make the monkey completely soaked. So the monkey tried a few times to get to the bananas, but there was this punishment every time, so the monkey gave up. Now they did something interesting. They added a second monkey that had not experienced this. What do you think is going to happen in this situation? What would you predict? Yeah, Nick, other monkeys will drag the new one down. That's precisely what happened, right? So the monkey comes in, he's trying to go for the stairs, but the first monkey stops this monkey aggressively, right? So we're not going to experience that again, okay? So they keep adding new monkeys, so a third, a fourth, a fifth, and every time the in-group gets larger, right, and more powerful. So the incumbents preventing the newcomers from going for the rewards, okay? Now they do something even more interesting. They actually take the original monkey out that actually experienced a negative event, and add yet another new monkey, okay? Now, none of the monkeys in the cage have experienced a negative event, yet they still see the same behavior, right? Newcomers preventing, the incumbents preventing the newcomer from going for the reward. And if you had somehow been able to talk to this new monkey, you would have asked potentially, like, why are you not going for the bananas? He's like, well, you know, this is just the way we do things around here, apparently, right? Now, this is a very strong symbolization of what we sometimes see in organizations, right? Where we have powerful inertial forces that are socialized across generations, right? And as a result, culture becomes sort of a negative constraint, right? So this is something, a trauma could have happened in the past. We had a realistic response, right? It could have led to risk avoidance. But that trauma can leave an imprint in the culture, right? So as a result, we fail to realize the potential of our organization. We fail to really get the most out of people inside the organization. Right? So to summarize, right, over time, organizations can become resistant to change. People have become used to particular practices or the way we do things around here, particularly around negative experiences that trigger certain behaviors that tend to be very sticky. And the banana then symbolizes an opportunity for improvement that the organization might struggle to realize as a result. All right, introducing this dynamic, I'm very curious if this resonates with you. If you have an example from your own organization or another organization of this dynamic that we could briefly look at. Who can think of something? Too many where to start, David writes. Yes.
Yeah, maybe I can chip in to get things going.
Please, yes.
Yeah, and I'm also sorry for joining late and also having lunch while attending this lecture, as it
No
is
problem at all.
busy day at the office. So, oh, and I have my screen blurred as well. So, I worked at several companies, large and small ones, and I have a pro sports background, so I've benefited from a positive culture, and I've experienced the detriment of culture as well.
Yeah.
Having worked at the AMC and the Schiphol Group,
Okay.
which are both large, very visible companies. So it's full of people trying to do good, but feeling the pressure of the external environment changing.
Yeah.
So for the Schiphol Group, one can say that we were so worried most people were so worried about how we were experienced in the media that things that were reported red via stop sign reporting method got greenwashed along the way when they reached the top, because people were expecting that the top didn't want to hear what were the real problems on the operational level of the company. And that was sometimes true, but sometimes not true, and it left the board being puzzled as why do we hear things so late?
Yeah.
And we always arrive late at the party when there's a problem. And then they acted sometimes in a way that was appropriate and sometimes in a way that was inappropriate, which only fueled the behavior of people not willing to report to the top level.
Yeah.
I've also experienced two CEOs, Marcel Levy at AMC, who really changed things around just by being interested on what was happening on the showroom floor level. And also Dick Benschop, who did the same in his earlier period, which was very, it worked very well until a crisis hit and he was late to respond. and as a result, the leadership behavior that was once appropriate in a former situation was not appropriate or deemed not appropriate in another situation.
Nice. Very powerful examples, and I think very recognizable for many. I see Jan Joost has a thought as well here, right? But two things. One is sort of the broader dynamic between the work floor and leadership, right? So empowerment in general, right? People taking initiative, taking action. B, information sharing, like transparent information sharing. And this is a classic example of where in the past, maybe things have happened inside the organization, right? Where people have experienced a negative effect of sharing information. Classic example is also around whistleblowing situations in organizations, right? It undermines ultimately the trust, right? And you get this dynamic where people are protecting their position. And I've experienced this in organizations as well, right? These are really difficult legacies to break, and it requires a very strong leader that truly understands that this is a culture and that requires cultural actions and not necessarily strategies to fix. Jan Joost.
Yeah, multiple possibilities here, of course, examples. So underscore, recognize the watermelon KPI reporting, green on the outside, red on the inside.
Watermelon reporting, that's a nice one.
From, let's say, history. So it's just like one time it goes to next, and then it's a culture, and people want to look good, all that stuff. So I think it's also not about people wanting to be bad or doing the wrong stuff.
Yeah.
It's just trying to do their best in a certain context. I think that's something we all need to recognize. Personally, I work at Philips, quite in the news. So as an example, we have a big company, quite complex, where we do medical devices. That's what we do. And their quality is one of the key things to do. But you also need to sell them, get the cash flow coming in, which is like the oil, to do your next innovation. And there's always an inherent natural tension between those. Like there's also always an interplay. So I think it's also about recognizing that like there's not one way of doing things, or it's recognizing that people are perhaps inherently good mostly.
Yeah.
And then recognizing this is like an ongoing journey where you have to look at culture or how we do things around here, and the way you consciously go about it. So that's a little bit my take on it, and also like a lot of things we're working on here.
Nice. I think that's great, right? So I think one thing that you said at the beginning was very powerful, right? In principle, people come in with the good intentions, but they find themselves in structures or social systems, right, that are to some degree beyond our control, right, that may push behavior in a certain direction in an unnoticed manner, right? So how can we, as leaders, but also as workers in general, critically reflect on the systems that we've built, right? Why do we do things a certain way, right? Ask that question. And the hard part, and we'll get there, is what are the places ultimately where we can start making a difference, right? Where can we actually make a change, right? Which is a more difficult part. David wrote also more in the chat, being a leader in a small purpose-driven outfit right now. I also experienced that even though we're all driven and good people, it is really hard to always model long-term beneficial behavior, especially so as everything only makes sense looking backwards, but I have to manage forwards. I think it's very, very, very good observation. Also, especially in a small organization where you think you might be growing and scaling, right? There's this tension where initially culture is very much implicitly understood by a small team, right? You can work on the personal relationships and everybody is there from the start. But how can you embed the purpose, the long-term value in a way that it will outlast you, right? Or outlast the leadership or outlast the founders, right? Again, that's a difficult challenge of thinking about how can you really craft a culture that lasts, a resilient culture, okay? We'll get to that towards the second half. One other problem, which sometimes it's a bit artificial how we separate them because they can sort of connect, but theoretically opposite problem we could face is a problem of cultural drift. So it relates a little bit to the brief banking example I just showed from Barclays. I've come to symbolize this as the O-ring problem, which refers to a classic case study of NASA, the space agency of the United States. And this is a story of the Challenger disaster, which happened towards the end of the 80s. NASA came off the back of a number of big successes. They had launched successful Apollo missions, and they now started to set themselves goals to actually make space travel more expedient, more cost efficient, more frequent, right? So they started to put some pressure on the organization. And in that process, they did something to their culture, okay? So they were well known for having a exceptional, strong safety and engineering culture, right? That really was the essence of their success. But then they increasingly brought in professional managers, right? Who were more outsiders to the engineering process. And that was a very gradual incremental process where over time, elements of their safety culture started to erode, okay? In this case, the disaster of the Challenger happened because there was a simple issue with an O-ring that was supposed to seal parts of the rocket, basically protecting the fuel from interacting with other parts of the engine. And the launch happened during a relatively more extreme weather day. The temperatures were different than usual, and the O-ring simply failed, right? And this led to this massive disaster, causing the lives of all people obviously involved, and actually did real damage to NASA's reputation. And how could such a simple defect actually cause, right, this? How could such a strong organization ultimately miss such a small, simple failure, right, in the process? So there's a whole book written on this, which is amazing, which I highly recommend. But the long story, the short summary of the long story is that the safety culture simply eroded, right? That over time, the organization started to take risks, right? They did tests. On paper, the tests seemed to succeed, but there were engineers in the organizations that were concerned, right? And this is very much David's situation to some degree. They had concerns. There were certain signals. They were hard to quantify, but the O-rings were not as strong as they had hoped for in the experiments, etc. But professional management ultimately was not able to act on that because they didn't get the information sufficiently. They dismissed it too early. All those kinds of dynamics were happening, right? So for me, this is a story that shows that when we are confronted with short-term pressures or performance pressures, organizations may become gradually more comfortable with risk-taking, right? And this happens slowly over time if no one pays attention, right? And if left unchecked, we can find ourselves in these disaster situations. This is symbolized now by a heavy accident, but if we look at our financial service system that we just discussed briefly before, it's a very similar kind of dynamic. Another example that was recently in the news is Boeing, the case of Boeing. There was a great, I think, bid on that by John Oliver in the last week tonight, which shows a very similar kind of dynamic going on, where culture ultimately erodes based on these short-term performance pressures that come in, right? So what can we do to actually protect these beneficial constraints from eroding under pressure is another question for making cultures resilient. All right, so what could we do that might be more successful? One company that I've studied at great length is Airbnb, all right? And this is a company that is, a typical Silicon Valley startup and scale up, taking over the entire world. But it's also quite a unique company because it was not founded by engineers. It was founded by two people with an arts degree, and yes, one engineer. But from day one, they took a different approach to starting out an organization. And this is something they started to realize over time and started to act on. Okay, and there's a lot you can find about this. But this is a memo that was written in 2014. And the memo that was written to the staff is actually published on this platform Medium, so you can find this. And the title of the memo was "Don't F Up the Culture." Okay, Brian Chesky wrote this, one of the founders, current CEO. And he said a number of interesting things in his memo. And he recounts a story of when Airbnb was still relatively small and they were trying to grow, and they had to, they were pitching to investors. They attracted an investor, and then they had this meeting. So one of their main investors was Theo, and they were sitting there and they had prepared this massive presentation. Okay, so they had prepared how they were going to grow, all the things they were going to implement and do to, get the investor the wanted returns. And the investor, in the beginning of the presentation, interrupted them and said, I don't need this slide deck. You don't need to do this presentation. I only have one message for you, and that is don't F up the culture. And he said, this is because I've invested in many companies, and I've seen most of my investments go wrong because these companies didn't think about culture on time, right? And then they created this gorilla that ultimately became unmanageable, and that is what destroyed any value in the organization. And that made them think. They said, there's something special that you have in your organization, and you need to protect that. You need to embed that. And that is ultimately what's going to create value in the long term. Okay. So he wrote in this memo, the thing that will endure for 100 years, the way it has for most 100-year companies, is the culture. The culture is what creates the foundation for all future innovation. If you break the culture, you break the machine that creates your products. We build culture by upholding our values in everything we do. It's 1,000 things, 1,000 times. It is living the core values when you hire. It's when you write an email, when you're working on a project, when you're walking down the hall. We all have the power by living the values to build the culture, but we also have the power by breaking the values to F up this culture. Each one of us has this opportunity, this burden, which is nice because we came to that conclusion ourselves a little bit earlier as well when we looked at that quote. But for me, this is very important, right? So again, starting with culture, culture is really the engine that drives everything. And how can we shape that? Does anybody have an idea what Airbnb's culture is about? What is it at the heart of their organization? Micah writes, making you feel welcome. Robert doesn't know. Sharing, says Gabi, yeah. It's a little bit related to both of these things. The essence of their organization is about belonging. So their mission, everything relates to this notion of belonging. We want to create a world and where everybody feels that they can belong. And that's embedded in their products, right? So when you travel somewhere, the idea is that you have the experience that you actually belong in that place, that you're not in some fake, inauthentic place for tourists, but that you're in the real place. But that also translates to how they want to run their organization, right? So everybody in the organization should feel like they really belong there and can be themselves there and have that impact, that positive impact, right? It's sort of the opposite culture of what David briefly described, where you're reluctant to share information, to be yourself, right? And feel that you're empowered and be heard, right? So now they face a crisis, right? Speaking about resiliency that we talked about earlier, the pandemic hits. And this is a real test, right? So overnight, basically, their business model was shattered, right? International travel stopped, and they knew they were going to have to make difficult decisions, and they knew they were going to have to let go of a substantial part of their workforce, right? So how can you maintain a culture of belonging when you have to let go of so many people? That was their challenge, their dilemma, right? And ultimately, they took their time, whereas other companies went quite quick, right? There were cases of massive firings over these online Zooms, town halls. But they quickly realized, no, this is a real test of our culture. If we do this right, it's an opportunity also for us to reaffirm our culture, right? Because the most important thing is the way we let go of people doesn't just send a signal to the people that are leaving, but also sends a signal to the people that are staying, right? If they don't understand how we made decisions, why we made decisions, and how that actually aligns with their values, right, we're going to break our culture in the process, right? So they took great care. There was a lot of communication. And again, you might be able to find some of this still. They publicly share this on their website. Brian Chesky wrote about this. A crisis brings you clarity about what is truly important. The world needs human connection now more than ever. And I know at Airbnb will rise to this occasion. Our mission is not merely about travel. What we are about is belonging. And at the center of belonging is love. Those are some powerful original words from a CEO of a big organization. But it shows that they really mean this stuff, right? So what did they do in the process, right? They went above and beyond to make sure that the people that had to leave ultimately had a clear narrative of why they had to leave and others got to stay, and vice versa, right? They also went beyond their legal responsibilities to make sure that people that had to leave had a soft landing, okay? With all the care they put in the process, the people that ultimately stayed, right, still felt that the company stood for this idea of belonging, right? So it was an exercise that actually reaffirmed their culture and made their culture stronger. During the pandemic, they were also, as a result, able to pivot super quickly to alternative business models. So they had within no time, they had a campaign where you could enjoy online experiences, right? So people could cook Italian food for you. And they had a campaign that actually tried to encourage people to then travel near. If you couldn't travel internationally, what are some of the places that are around the corner, right? Not, mind-blowing innovations, but the organization was very resilient in being able to shift their business model quickly in times of difficulty, right? What I found in my interactions with the organization is that the amount of social challenges they face, also with the business model in general, and the size of their organization, sort of the number of actual people that they have working there, I never understand how it works. I think, how is this organization still able to make a profit? Because there's so many places in which they can be hit. Regulation changes anywhere across the world, trust issues, etc. Right? But there's something special about the culture there that allows people to truly care for the organization as a whole, people to go beyond their individual roles, right? And really, in that sense, make the organization resilient. Right. Now, what can we learn from this case that might travel to other contexts, right? And for me, one thing that we can learn about is how we can look at culture, right? Culture not necessarily as a thing that we can design and then fix, but understanding how culture is experienced, how culture can be shaped in an organization, right? So we are using a model. Model always right away has a limitation. But it starts with that idea that we have an essence, okay? And I'm going to build on the model from Jerry Johnson that talks about culture as a web, okay? And the idea that ultimately there's something difficult to grasp that we really want to embed in the organization, okay? And this is not necessarily to say that there's always only one thing we want to embed, right? We can use this framework flexibly. We can look for an improvement in our organization and try and think about what is it that we want to embed. In the case of Airbnb, right, what they wanted to embed is this sense of belonging inside the organization, okay? Going back in time a little bit, they were facing this problem where they were growing. So they had a small organization. This was all relatively implicit. And now they became a bigger organization where naturally some of the ties between employees and between leaderships and employees were going to be put under pressure, okay? And they also faced that at that stage, some of the dynamics that David just shared with us were creeping into their organization. People at the bottom of the organization didn't really understand anymore why certain strategic decisions were being made. They didn't really feel that they were being heard properly anymore, right? So they recognized this and they start seeing this right away as a problem of belonging, okay? So we want to embed this idea of belonging deeply inside the organization. So, the essence could be anything, right? It could be about values, it could be about principles, just simple properties that we would like to have at the heart of everything we do in an organization. Now, the next step that we can think about is, okay, if we want to embed belonging in our organization or inclusion or anything else you want to think of, what is at the edges, so to say? So what are some of the other things we need to make this happen, right? So this is my own term. But these are sort of secondary values or principles or properties that can support or safeguard this essence, okay? So we want to create a culture of belonging. What do we need? Well, we need inclusion. We need maybe social safety, right? People need to be able to speak up when they want to. We need maybe a learning culture where people are always open to each other's ideas, right? So these are things that are becoming slightly more concrete, but these are all things we will need in place to achieve our deeper embedded essence, so to say. Okay. All right, that feels maybe abstract. Does anybody have a question? I see David had one in the chat. Besides a great foundation, does this allow for subcultures? I think that's a very good one that we can pick up here, right? So again, I don't approach culture as a big design exercise where we're designing a straitjacket. It's much more a balancing act, right? So there's many things we want to achieve. There's something that we want to stand for. And our practical question is always about, there's something we want to improve. We've picked up an issue in the organization. We've diagnosed, right? There is a lack of belonging. There's a lack of trust. There's a lack of transparency, right? How can we rebalance that by thinking through this model to some degree? And yes, that does mean that we may actually want to have subcultures. We may actually want to have diversity as long as there is something that we can all agree on, right? So culture of belonging naturally, or inclusion, right, is a concept that almost by definition requires subcultures. Right? Feel free to ask any questions in the chat or put up your hand, interrupt me. Okay. So for me, one question that I would have for you is, if you start using this framework to some degree, what is it that you would want to improve culturally inside your organization? What is it that you really want to have deeply embedded inside the organization? Right? Capturing that in a label, something that you would hope that if you say we're the founder of an organization, I would outlive you, right? And then the second step would be, okay, what are some of the things that relate to that I've called the edges, right? That sort of protect this. Yeah. So that's an exercise that could help to get you going. Second step is then to think about, okay, now where does culture actually live, right? So where are we confronted with it? Where can things go wrong? But also then where can we shape it positively? Okay. And this is what I call materialized culture. Right? So these are the places, systems, practices, and objects that carry and animate it, right? The simple answer is, it basically lives everywhere, right? But what are some of the buckets that we can think about, and what are some of the areas that we can start thinking about actually making a difference? In a big organization, who is responsible for culture generally? Moshin asks. That's a good question. And Gabi says right away, everyone. I would agree. I would agree, Gabi. Everyone, but I think there is indeed, especially the higher up the organization, the more important is that you're reflective about how you are impacting culture. Okay. And again, I've met my fair share of leaders that are not fully aware of their role in culture. And as a result, they struggle to realize the improvements that they hope to achieve. Thank you for sharing that. The CEO delegates it to HR. I also see Robert John writing, I'm working quite a lot with the organization who wants to become more sustainable, yet it mainly stays with words. But when it comes to actions, it seems to lack. What is required to get this change started? Do you need first a new narrative? That's a well-timed question. I think we can try and walk through the model with that question in mind. Nick also says, everyone but leaders are the ones with the most power to break the culture and its building process. Very nice summary of what I tried to say, Nick, hold on. So yeah, so indeed, let's imagine this Robert John scenario, right? We want to really embed a culture where we care for society or the environment first, right, before ourselves. So how can we make sure that we improve in that area? What are some of the elements we need around the edges there? But then most importantly, how can we make sure we actually walk the talk? Oh, there was one aside that I had. I've included this in this model as well as an addition that I had. We can think about quantified culture. And quantified culture are the metrics used to measure outcomes that might reflect culture. Okay. I'm not sure if this is a trend in your organization, but in my organization, it certainly is, that most of the engagement with culture that I see, or most of the energy, goes towards surveys in which we're trying to quantify, right? Which is great. It's a helpful tool, but oftentimes our resources are, let's say, unevenly distributed. Okay, we place a lot of value on this, but it has substantial limitations, right? For me, elements of culture that you can quantify are limited. So it's just one input that you as a leader should interpret. You need to understand it. But it always requires an engagement with the actual organization to truly understand what is going on culturally. A, to truly understand the quantifiable elements. B, also to be able to pick up on other things that you won't see in a survey, right? So just as an important point to share here. It's the whole package. Now, where can we start affecting culture? So to Robert Jan's question, indeed, it would start with potentially a narrative, right? So if you want to improve your culture or really embed a culture, the most powerful way to do it is to start with a strong story, right? Where are we now? Where do we want to go? What do we want to improve? What do we want to stand for, right? These are all things that require the craft of storytelling. Okay? Then we need symbols to back that up, right? We need actually people symbols, right? People that authentically stand for this stuff, right? So a leader that tells that story also needs to right away reflect it in their behavior. Okay? This is where I've seen many things already go wrong. Okay, so in the case of the bank that we started with, okay, they had people come in that started to craft these powerful stories about the new purpose of the bank, the new culture that was going to be embedded, and even put some metrics in place. But then leadership changed, and the stories were still there. They were still acting on it. But then there was an instance, for instance, where the leader started to act directly against some of the core values, quite openly and publicly, right? This was a case around whistleblowing and the leader going after someone that had whistleblowed, tried to find out their identity. And I was teaching in this program, I was interacting with these cohorts, and I saw the massive impact that that behavior had on the cohort, right? They right away didn't believe, right, in this culture anymore. The credibility was gone just because of simple acts of a leader. So this is already the hard part, right? Can we have consistency in how the leaders symbolize this culture and that truly align with this story, right? So this requires a lot from how we hire, right? How we onboard people, all that kind of stuff. Other symbols we can talk about, right? There's many things that have a symbolic function. It can range from the way we talk to the way we dress to our build environment. But the most important, the hardest work, right, comes here, right? And these are the other elements, the more formal elements of the organization, and they all have a role to play in how we shape culture. They all reflect culture. They are all places where we can shape culture, right? So on the right-hand side, we have organizational structures and power structures. The organizational structures are about, right, how have we divided decision-making authority, responsibilities, can be more hierarchical, can be more flat. Power structures are independent of that because those are about who ultimately has the real ability to make something happen in an organization. So in a startup like Airbnb, something they faced was that the informal power structure was that at the end of the day, coders and engineers had an exorbitant amount of power because they were scarce. If you wanted to get something done that had an impact on the platform, you always had to go through the engineering department. Okay, so the decisions they made had a real impact on what the organization was able to do. Right? So if you want to respond to an emerging problem in a particular market that had regulation issues, right, and they really wanted to take their responsibility seriously of collaborating with these local environments to regulate and address problems, they still needed engineers to agree with them and act on that as well, right? So do these power structures allow you to actually live up to your culture? And on the left-hand side, we have typical things that all organizations struggle with. Our control systems is a bucket term for how we reward people, how we promote people, how we make sure we're staying on budget, right? Again, here we can have a whole spectrum of things that can go in there. And finally, rituals and routines. And I'll spend a little bit more time on that one because I find that one very interesting, right? So what are the things we do regularly, every day or every week, right? And how do they reflect our culture? Okay, and these are very small things, but they can add up to a big difference, right? So one simple example is the way that we run meetings. Okay, a meeting is very much it has an instrumental purpose, but it has a very, very ritualistic element to it, right? There's a standard structure, and every organization has maybe their own approach. Every culture has its own approach on the national level, and Airbnb recognized this. So something that Airbnb had recognized in their situation are values around belonging are under pressure. People do not longer feel included as much. They feel that they're not being heard. They lack some empowerment. And they did a number of changes. And one change they made was every meeting needs to end with the airing of 3 things. Okay. What needs to be aired is vomit, dead fish, and elephants. This is true. You can look this up. Vomit refers to complaints. Okay. So towards the end of the meeting, say, okay, great, meeting is over. We now have 15 minutes to air vomit. Who has vomit to air? Okay. And people would feel encouraged to complain about stuff in a safe space, right? It was now allowed. Dead fish, anything that has happened in the past that technically shouldn't really matter anymore, but you're still sort of caught up in. It's still hanging on. It's still affecting the way you interact with other people or the organization. They stink, dead fish. Okay, so bring out any dead fish. And the third thing was elephants, right? And that's the intuitive one. Is there anything that's on everybody's mind, but no one is saying, right? It's such a small, very playful interjection, but it did all those things that they needed, right? It allowed people in a growing organization to find that space to be heard, right? And in a way that didn't necessarily interrupt, right, the running of the organization. And that was a platform for also information to trickle up and be heard more broadly. So one example. But again, it's 1,000 things 1,000 times. And the hard part is indeed to go from the symbolic side and the story side towards the hard side of the organization. Okay. One big struggle that we had in financial service organizations was they talked a lot about the importance of the how, right? So how did you manage this client? How did you get to this positive outcome, right? Did you actually uphold the values in the process? But their control system, their reward system was very much based on quantitative information. Okay? It was always based on your quarterly figures. Right? So how can we then start thinking about the how? That becomes a qualitative judgment. Okay. So for the longest time, they had this story and these symbols in place. But at the end of the day, what was most meaningful was, am I going to get my bonus? And how is that judged? Right? As long as that's still judged on principles that are sort of counter to the story and symbols, it's not going to help, right? So there they've made incremental improvements where we really have to build a new system where now people get a more qualitative assessment, right? Which again requires a lot from the organization. I'm looking for a few more questions. Christina wrote, if it's a leadership team that defines the overall culture, how can we help to not have ego in the room? Isn't it important to have consensus, or does the need to be decision maker if everyone has their own views, just wants to be heard? Yeah, I think it's a very important point, right? So who is the culture? Where is the culture? In order to symbolize the culture, it first place requires having really good senses, really being able to listen. What lives in the organization? How are people, at the lower levels of the organization experiencing it, right? Only then can you start symbolizing it. Only then can you start understanding what may be lacking or how you may be affecting it. This is a difficult skill, right? It's a craft. Boeing leadership failed to get traction with the whistleblower program. No one trusted it. Yes, right? So again, we can have great policies in place, but if we don't have the culture to back it up, not going to happen. Micah writes, how about the traumas in the organization of the past and the impact the traumas have in the present moment? Where do they fit in this picture? Is this part of the rituals and routines? Yes, so one place they could come out is in these meetings, right? So if you have dead fish, that's a place where we can talk about the traumas, right? We can bring them up, even if they weren't technically relevant in that context of why we were having the meeting. Towards the end, we can still start talking about them in a small scale. So that's one place. Robert John, what are your thoughts in changing culture? Is it better to make bigger steps so people feel it's actually different? As when you make small steps, it feels too little to actually feel that there is a difference? Or better do take small steps to prevent resistance, or another way? Yeah. This is very context dependent as well, but generally culture only changes incrementally, right? It's definitely not something you can easily change overnight, especially not in an established organization. So the challenge is to be bold in your stories, I would say, right? I think those need to be powerful and grab people's attention. There you cannot be too incremental, but then also realistic in terms of how you're going to get there, right? So that's a challenge. That's saying this is where we want to be. That's what we want to stand for. yet at the same time we recognize, right, that we have a way to go to actually get there, right? And then you need to consider all these elements, and this is, you know, a massive abstraction, all these elements where we can start making it better, right? And you need everybody on board to get there. And then you need to be consistent, right? You need to remind people. You cannot do this in one point and then not communicate again, right? It's all those places where you can reinforce that message, reinforce that story, so that people actually start believing it and buying it. All right. Big topic. We covered a lot of ground. This is the end of what I had to say for today. I love the interaction, love the engagement. I loved some of the examples that came out. They were very helpful. I hope this offered you a few additional insights that you can actually use to understand your own organization's culture, but also your own role in it. If this triggers your interest, we have a bigger program that I'm part of. You can download the brochure or go to the website. If you have any questions, my colleague Erica is here as well. We will also be in touch by email just to connect with you and let you know of any future events we might be organizing. I just want to thank you all again for your attention. Hope you enjoyed your lunch in the meantime, David, and wish you a very nice rest of the day and a great Easter weekend. I'll hang around for a few more minutes. So for anybody that wants to stay around and ask some questions, feel free to do so. Thank you very much.